Hello, my friends. Over the last 24 hours, the aftershocks from the explosive publication of the new U.S. National Security Review have continued to rattle the entire Western system. The Russians, the Chinese, and the key players in the Middle East have all read it carefully. They see Washington openly signaling retrenchment, a desire to prioritize the Western Hemisphere, and an implicit admission that American power has limits. For them, this is noteworthy, but not shocking. They always assumed the United States would eventually be forced back within the boundaries of reality. In Europe, it is another story entirely. There, the political class is in profound shock. European governments have now absorbed what this document says about the relationship between the United States and Europe. This is not some think tank essay. It is an official U.S. government document signed off by the president himself with a presidential preface. It therefore reflects the outlook of the current administration. And what it says about Europe is brutally dismissive. The review describes Europe as a continent in decline, a civilization in decline. It portrays the institutions of the European Union as structurally hostile to economic growth, development, and creativity. It criticizes Brussels for authoritarian reflexes and censorship, noting that these habits are fundamentally at odds with the traditional self-image of the Western alliance. It points particularly to EU migration policies and warns that over time, Europe's cultures and even its demographic makeup are being transformed to such an extent that future European populations may not feel the same identification with the West at all and may place much less value on an alliance with the United States. From the point of view of Europe's ruling class, this is devastating. For 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, the entire premise of European strategy has rested on two assumptions. First, that there exists a collective West, a joint enterprise in which the United States is the senior partner, but in which European governments and elites hold a real stake. Second, that there are effectively no limits to American power, that if Washington truly commits itself to an objective, it will ultimately prevail. On that basis, European policymakers have convinced themselves that they can pursue maximalist ideological projects at home while outsourcing hard security and strategic decision-making to the United States. The security review blows holes in both assumptions. It makes clear that Washington no longer sees Europe as a trusted, co-equal partner, but rather as a problematic, increasingly dysfunctional dependency. And beneath the rhetoric, Europeans can see something else that frightens them even more, a shift inside the United States itself. Larger segments of the American public are becoming skeptical of the foreign policy Washington has pursued for the last 80 years. There is growing concern about the limits of American resources and capabilities. More and more people in the U.S. are starting to ask whether their country is overextended and whether permanent commitments in Europe, especially in Ukraine, still make sense. For European elites who have bet everything on the fantasy of limitless American power, this is profoundly destabilizing. But what truly terrifies them is not just how the review talks about Europe, it is how it talks about Russia. The document does not frame Russia as an eternal adversary or irredeemable enemy. Instead, it treats Russia as a state with which the United States must eventually restore a degree of stability, especially in Europe, so that Washington can gradually draw down its presence on the continent and focus on other priorities. In other words, the review implicitly acknowledges what anyone honest can see: victory over Russia in Ukraine is no longer realistic, and the rational course is to move toward a stable arrangement with Moscow. That is exactly what Russia has been demanding since the late Soviet period, through the Perestroika era and after the USSR collapsed. For decades, Moscow has proposed a new European security architecture that reflects the realities of power and geography. The West has consistently rejected such proposals, preferring to expand NATO and treat Russia as a permanent enemy. Now, in this review, there is a clear sign that at least some in Washington are ready to rethink that approach. For Europe's political class, this is heresy. They have spent years demonizing Russia as an expansionist monster that will swallow Ukraine and then march straight on to conquer the rest of Europe if it is not stopped in Donbass. They repeat this story endlessly to their own populations, yet suddenly they find that their supposed protector across the Atlantic no longer shares this worldview. Instead, key figures in the United States now argue that it is in America's interest to stabilize relations with Russia, bring the war in Ukraine to an end, and work with Moscow to establish a sustainable order in Europe. That is not just a tactical disagreement. It is a fundamental divergence of strategic vision between Washington and the European capitals. You can already see the panic and denial in Europe's responses. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has rushed out to proclaim that there is still such a thing as a collective West, insisting that the West is strongest when united against enemies and adversaries, by which he clearly means Russia. Other European leaders are making similar statements, but in the corridors of power, in the chanceries and ministries, there is a palpable sense of simultaneous depression and panic. The old certainties are collapsing, and they have no replacement. Behind that emotional shock lies a very practical fear that the United States is preparing to distance itself from, or even end, its deep involvement in the conflict in Ukraine. Consider the speech delivered by Donald Trump Jr., which hit Europe like a thunderclap. He lambasted Zelensky, attacked the cult-like adoration built around him by the left and by European elites, and highlighted the massive corruption in Kyiv that Western media have systematically ignored. He made it very clear that the United States should not be the idiot with the checkbook, endlessly writing checks to underwrite European policy in Ukraine. Formally, Trump Jr. is not part of the U.S. government. He holds no official position, but everyone understands that he is very close to his father and likely reflects views within the White House. And when you set his speech alongside the official line in the National Security Review, the message is unmistakable. The patience of Washington with this endless war is running out. All of this dovetails with what Europeans already know has been happening behind the scenes around the so-called 28-point plan, the set of discussion points the Americans have floated to the Russians. It has never been a full-fledged peace plan, and it has never existed as a formal draft agreement, but it does contain elements. Moscow has publicly said it can work with Ukraine renouncing any bid to join NATO, limits on the size of Ukraine's armed forces, and recognition of Russian security interests. For the Europeans, these ideas are ideological blasphemy. They are completely unacceptable to the hardliners in Warsaw, the Baltic states, and many in Berlin, Paris, and Brussels. And they know full well that one of Moscow's non-negotiable demands goes further still. Withdrawal of Ukrainian forces, not only from Donbass, but from all four regions that Russia has formally incorporated: Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. Putin has been absolutely clear on this point, including in his interviews and remarks in India and in earlier press conferences in Bishkek. He has left no doubt about the territorial baseline Russia now considers a prerequisite for any settlement. The Europeans also know that the Americans have raised the question of a Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbass in their 28 discussion points. So what are they doing? They are actively encouraging Kyiv to resist U.S. pressure and refuse any withdrawal from Donbass, even though they understand that this is non-negotiable for Moscow. European support for Ukraine's refusal to compromise is not diminishing. It is intensifying, and they are not alone. Within the United States itself, there are powerful figures, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, being widely cited as one who also do not want to see a strategic shift toward accommodation with Russia. In meetings with Ukrainian officials, including the recent discussions in Florida, these hawks are signaling that Kyiv should stand firm and reject any concession on territory. What we are witnessing, in other words, is a split inside the American system and a desperate maneuver by the Europeans to lock the United States back into a hardline anti-Russian posture by ensuring that the war cannot be wound down on realistic terms. Meanwhile, the facts on the ground in Ukraine move relentlessly in Moscow's favor, no matter what fantasies the West tells itself. Take the latest article in the Daily Telegraph, based on material from the Institute for the Study of War. Even that deeply biased outfit admits that Russia captured around 200 square miles of territory in November, the fastest rate of advance since 2022. In reality, the gains are larger than they are prepared to acknowledge, but even this partial admission tells you which way the momentum's going. Then, in the same piece, they blandly claim that the town of Pakhovsk is about to fall, as if this is a future possibility. They carefully omit the fact that the Russians have already announced that Pakhovsk has fallen. They ignore the fact that Bill Saitan has published on the situation there, confirming Russian control. They pretend not to have heard the impassioned speech by Ukrainian MP Mariana Bezuglia in the Verkhovna Rada, in which she herself stated that Pakhovsk had fallen. Instead, the Telegraph and others cling to the familiar narrative. Yes, Russia advances, but only inch by inch. Yes, it takes ground, but at catastrophic cost. Yes, it might eventually take the rest of Donbass, but only after many years of grinding warfare. I doubt many serious people in uniform believe this anymore, but that narrative will be heavily promoted over the coming weeks because it gives European governments a pretext to keep pushing Kyiv to fight on. On the battlefield, the picture looks very different. In recent days, Russia has carried out large-scale missile and drone strikes on Ukraine 3 nights in a row, with each salvo appearing larger than the last. The latest attack was massive, with Kiev once again a primary target. These are not symbolic pinpricks. They are sustained, systematic operations that erode Ukraine's military infrastructure, energy grid, and logistical backbone. At the same time, the Russian Ministry of Defense has provided a rather revealing snapshot of the front. In the north, along the Kupiansk-Oskol axis, Russian forces have inflicted heavy losses on mechanized brigades of the Ukrainian army. Units of the Western Group of Forces are continuing to compress and eliminate the encircled Ukrainian grouping on the eastern bank of the Oskol River, a force of roughly 15 battalions pushed out of key settlements and now trapped in open fields. Assault detachments of the 6th Army have liberated Kucherovka, one of the key villages in that pocket. Put together, these reports suggest that the Russians are in the final stages of a classic cauldron battle, steadily tightening the noose around a large Ukrainian force east of the Oskol. Against this, Kiev and its Western backers have floated stories of massive Ukrainian counterattacks that supposedly drove the Russians back and restored Ukrainian control over parts of Kupiansk. I do not believe these claims for a second. They remind me of earlier boasts about recapturing locations like Klishchiivka near Bakhmut, which were repeatedly announced as Ukrainian victories despite a total lack of verifiable evidence and despite the eventual confirmation that Russian control was never really broken. By contrast, the Russian Ministry of Defense, while far from perfect, has generally been more reliable about the broad evolution of the front when they say that Kucherovka is under Russian control and that assault detachments are eliminating encircled Ukrainian units. The logic of the situation points to an imminent collapse of that entire grouping on the eastern bank of the Oskol. But even that is not the most decisive area at the moment. The Pakhovsk-Mirnograd sector is arguably more important. Drone footage from the roads leading into Pakhovsk from the north and west shows kilometer after kilometer of burned out and destroyed vehicles, almost all Ukrainian. These hulks are the remnants of repeated attempts to resupply the now encircled Ukrainian garrison in Mirnograd and the residue of failed counterattacks in the wider Pakhovsk area. Ukraine does not possess an infinite pool of vehicles. It cannot afford to lose armored transports, trucks, and specialized equipment on this scale. The images also clearly show that many of the destroyed vehicles were civilian ordinary passenger cars pressed into service as ad hoc military transports. One has to ask, who in their right mind would choose to drive into a war zone under Russian drones and artillery in a civilian car with no protection? The answer is that no one would do this unless they were totally desperate. It is a glaring symptom of the extent of Ukraine's logistical crisis. Within this context, the latest Russian Defense Ministry statement is extremely telling. Units of the Center Group of Forces, the main Russian formation in the Pakhovsk area, have completed the liberation of Rivia, a village situated between Pakhovsk and Mirnograd. Rivia essentially links the two. Its loss means that the Russian ring around Mirnograd's Ukrainian garrison, estimated at around 1,000 troops, is now not just tight, but constricting further. The Russians report that they control the southern and central parts of Mirnograd, as well as significant sections of its northeastern quadrant. By adding control of Rivia to this, they are effectively closing off the northwestern approaches as well. At the same time, the Defense Ministry notes that units of the center group are eliminating encircled Ukrainian troops in Dmitrov, essentially Mirnograd, and mopping up Ukrainian forces in Gishino. The language matters. Mopping up implies that organized resistance in Gishino is collapsing and that its full capture is imminent. Just as important is what the Russian report does not say. There is no mention of continuing Ukrainian counterattacks in this sector. That strongly suggests that the much-touted Ukrainian counteroffensive efforts here have run their course, bled dry, and that surviving Ukrainian units are withdrawing or hunkering down in a shrinking pocket with no realistic prospect of relief. Nor is this the only sector where Russia advances. In the Zaporozhye region, Russian forces have reportedly reached Varvarovka, just north of Guliaipol, and taken control of all parts of Guliaipol east of the river that runs through the town, roughly 20% of the settlement. The fight in this region continues, but I see no sign that Ukraine has been able to stabilize the line. Instead, positions are gradually giving way. Further north, intense fighting continues around Lyman and Sever, with reports that the Russians are tightening the ring around Ukrainian troops west of Sever, isolating them in yet another shrinking pocket. There are also indications that Russia is increasing pressure on Konstantinovka, east of Bakhmut, tightening a noose in that area as well. Set against this reality, the Western narrative that the battle is not lost, that Ukraine can somehow hold out indefinitely while Russia exhausts itself, is simply not connected to the facts on the ground. The situation for Ukraine deteriorates day by day. The army is shrinking as more soldiers desert or are rendered ineffective, while Russian forces grow in strength, manpower, and material. Yet the Western political class remains willfully blind to the obvious implications. And this brings us back to Europe's strategy to head off any American move toward disengagement, toward what could eventually become a genuine divorce between the United States and Europe, and with it, the effective end of NATO European leaders are pursuing a course that is not just reckless, but suicidal. They close their eyes to the military reality that Ukraine is losing. They ignore the economic reality that Ukraine is financially bankrupt and depends entirely on infusions of Western cash just to keep the lights on. They pretend not to see the political reality in Kyiv, where corruption, scandals, and internal power struggles are eating away at the regime from within. They refuse to recognize that what they are looking at is a system in decay, moving toward eventual collapse. Instead, they obsess over money, schemes, and legal gimmicks. They're pushing Belgium to approve a €140 billion loan backed by the income generated from frozen Russian assets in Euroclear. Belgium, to its credit, has so far resisted. The European Central Bank has voiced doubts. The International Monetary Fund, too, has signaled opposition or deep concern, yet the EU establishment presses ahead. In Britain, the government talks openly about seizing £8 billion of Russian assets. Some of those are almost certainly private holdings belonging to individuals, because it is hard to believe the Russian state keeps anything close to that amount in the UK these days. Perhaps there are some securities or gold reserves in London, but the era when Moscow stored major portions of its national reserves under British jurisdiction is long gone, and almost certainly ended well before the special military operation began. None of that deters Europe's leaders. They are determined to move forward with this plan to misappropriate Russian assets, even though it will gravely damage Europe's financial reputation, rattle confidence in the euro, and likely trigger capital flight away from European markets. Why? One important reason now is precisely that the Americans oppose it. Washington understands that outright seizure of Russian sovereign assets would be seen by Moscow as an act of economic warfare and would become a central issue in any negotiation. Russia would insist that the money be returned in full as part of any settlement. The Europeans, having stolen the assets, would dig in and demand reparations instead. Moscow will never agree to that. The result would be to blow up any realistic prospect of a negotiated end to the conflict. From the American perspective, at least for those now thinking in terms of retrenchment and stabilization, this is an unnecessary, self-inflicted obstacle to peace. But for the Europeans who are desperate to prevent any rapprochement between Washington and Moscow, that is precisely the point. If seizing Russian assets makes it impossible to strike a deal with Russia, that suits them fine. It keeps the war going. It keeps Russia designated as the eternal enemy. And it forces the Americans, they hope, to remain tethered to Europe. This is an extraordinary level of strategic miscalculation. American officials are beginning to grasp just how obstructive and indeed hostile Europe's Brussels-centric leadership has become. Some have openly noted that the same people who run the EU are the ones they see across the table in NATO meetings, that NATO and the EU function in practice as a single political and ideological bloc headquartered in Brussels. So the obvious question arises, why should the United States continue to tolerate an alliance structure in which supposed allies systematically undercut U.S. strategy and pursue policies that run counter to Washington's stated objectives? If Ukraine collapses and the current trajectory points in that direction, and if there is no peace settlement because the Europeans have destroyed the diplomatic space by seizing Russian assets and blocking compromise, then a monumental transatlantic clash is virtually guaranteed. The Americans will say, we wanted to stabilize relations with Russia, end the war on reasonable terms, and prevent Ukraine from total destruction. It was Europe, with its fanatical refusal to recognize reality and its insistence on prolonging a lost war, that sabotaged those efforts and brought on the disaster. The Europeans, for their part, will shriek that it was American betrayal of Ukraine that caused the catastrophe, that Washington lost its nerve, abandoned Kyiv, and thereby doomed Ukraine and endangered Europe. This has the potential to become a rupture between the United States and Europe on a scale not seen in the post-war era. I am not saying it is inevitable. Politics can always take unexpected turns. But if events follow the logic now visible, if Ukraine's economic situation becomes even more catastrophic by the end of the winter, if Russian forces score further major breakthroughs in Donbass, if Europe's attempt to weaponize Russian assets backfires financially, then I will not be surprised to see precisely this kind of bitter mutual recrimination. Russia, for its part, will continue to prosecute the war methodically, relying on its industrial base, manpower reserves, and the simple fact that it is fighting on its own doorstep for interests it considers existential. The longer European and American elites refuse to acknowledge this reality, the harsher the reckoning will be when the illusion finally breaks.